Hello everyone, welcome to SleepSpace. Tonight, we will talk about what happens to your mind or consciousness during a coma. Thank you for being here, settling in with your own thoughts, and giving yourself a moment in your day to simply listen, imagine, and reflect. Tonight's topic is both mysterious and deeply human. It touches the place where biology, awareness, and the unknown all meet. Most people will thankfully never experience a coma. Yet almost everyone wonders the same question. What actually happens inside the mind when the body appears still, unresponsive and quiet? Is consciousness gone, paused, hidden somewhere, or transformed into something we can't measure? A coma is often described medically as a state of prolonged unconsciousness, but that phrase barely touches the deeper reality. It doesn't tell you what the person might feel, what the brain might be doing, or whether any part of the inner self remains awake behind the curtain. It also doesn't explain why some people wake with vivid recollections, strange dreams, or profound insights, while others open their eyes with no memory at all. Something is happening inside that closed-off space, something that science can measure in fragments, but not fully explain. To begin our journey, imagine the mind as a city at night. When you're fully awake, every building is glowing with activity. Thoughts race like cars down busy streets. Sensations flow like people filling the sidewalks. Every district, memory, emotion, movement, identity is alive with its own kind of light. This is what the waking brain feels like internally. Coordinated, interactive, brilliant. But during a coma, that city becomes dim. Not completely dark, but selective. Some neighborhoods flicker while others shut down entirely. Activity might still exist, but it runs on its own mysterious schedule. Instead of the bustling life you know, the mind becomes a quieter, stranger landscape, one we haven't fully mapped. The fascinating part is that the coma state is not uniform. There is no single type of coma experience. Instead, it's more like a spectrum of altered awareness. Some people in deep comas show almost no brain responsiveness at all. Others show subtle patterns that hint the mind might still be processing information on a hidden level. This is why stories vary so widely. Some people awaken with memories of floating, traveling, or witnessing scenes they cannot logically explain. Others say they were in a blank, timeless void. And some awaken unaware they were ever unconscious. These differences suggest that consciousness is not simply on or off. It shifts, folds, retracts, or hides depending on the circumstances. To understand this better, imagine consciousness as a light that doesn't fully disappear when switched off. Instead, it dims into a low, barely perceptible glow, a glow that still exists even if it cannot illuminate anything clearly. During a coma, the brain's energy use drops dramatically, and many networks stop communicating. But that doesn't mean the core spark is gone. It may just be quiet, turned inward, or functioning in a different mode. If waking consciousness is like standing in a brightly lit room, then a coma is like wandering through the same room in darkness. The space is still there, but the awareness of it is altered. Consider what happens during anesthesia, which some people describe as nothingness. Yet even in anesthesia, the brain doesn't fully shut down. It simply loses the ability to form memories or assemble coherent awareness. Coma is similar in a structural sense, but deeper, longer, and less predictable. Instead of a controlled, reversible switch, it's more like an emergency mode the brain enters to protect itself. The challenge for scientists is that they cannot ask someone what they're experiencing while in this state. They can only analyze brainwaves, monitor reactions, and collect stories after the person awakens. This leaves a wide gap, one that allows mystery to slip in. Within that mystery lies one of the most intriguing questions. Does consciousness continue internally even when the body stops responding externally? Many researchers believe it does, at least in some form. They've seen subjects in comas respond to familiar voices with subtle changes in brain activity. Some patients show increased brain waves when a loved one enters the room or when music from their past is played. These reactions are not visible from the outside, but they hint that part of the self is still home, listening through a thick fog. Not fully present, but not absent either. It's as if consciousness retreats into a small, protected corner of the mind, functioning quietly until the outside world becomes reachable again. Other people describe their coma experiences not as fog, but as vivid landscapes, dreamlike places that feel strangely consistent, almost like alternate realities. Some recall long journeys, emotional conversations, or symbolic visions they cannot explain. These reports raise deep philosophical questions. If the brain is inactive or sparingly active, where do these experiences come from? And why do so many people report similar patterns like bright environments, tunnels, or encounters with loved ones? Science can explain some of this as the brain stitching fragments together, but not all. Sometimes the imagery seems meaningful in a way that does not match random firing. It feels purposeful, as if the mind is trying to communicate with itself. In many coma stories, time works differently. There is no sequence of events, no clear beginning or end. Some individuals say the experience felt like a moment lasting forever, or an eternity compressed into a moment. This distortion aligns with what we know about the brain's internal clock, which becomes disrupted when normal consciousness fades. But the quality of these timeless moments often feels too rich or symbolic to be dismissed as pure hallucination. They echo the way the subconscious communicates in dreams, mysterious, emotional, non-linear, yet deeply revealing. Interestingly, the brain of a person in a coma is not simply broken. In many cases, the brain is trying to protect itself, reorganize, or slow down to heal. This shift can temporarily disable the systems needed for external responsiveness while preserving internal ones. Think of it like a computer entering a safe mode after a crash. The screen may be black, but the machine is still running behind the scenes, analyzing, stabilizing, and waiting for the chance to reboot. A person looking at that computer would think it's off, even though it isn't. The same illusion happens with the human mind. Another layer to this mystery involves identity. Who are you while in a coma? Are you still yourself if you cannot think in words, recognize your environment, or respond to others? Some philosophers argue that consciousness is continuous regardless of its visibility. The you that exists during deep unconscious states, like dreamless sleep, anesthesia, and coma, may not be the thinking self, but it is still the core presence. Others believe that consciousness flickers in and out, reassembling itself only when enough neural activity returns. But the people who awaken with rich emotional memories challenge both explanations. They suggest that some version of self-awareness can survive even when the brain's communication networks are quiet. Researchers have also discovered that even during prolonged unresponsiveness, the brain may still show bursts of coordinated activity that resemble dream patterns. These bursts can appear minutes or hours before a person begins to regain awareness. It's almost like the mind is testing its circuits, warming up, or slowly resurfacing. These moments are fleeting and often unpredictable, but they reveal something important. Consciousness is more resilient than we once assumed. The stories of individuals who heard everything while unresponsive are particularly compelling. They recall conversations around them, music that was playing, or even specific phrases whispered into their ears. These accounts are validated by studies showing that the brain can still process sound on a basic level, even when outwardly unresponsive. But the depth of these remembered sounds suggests something more. Perhaps the mind holds on to certain sensory threads, storing them in a quiet vault until the person returns to full awareness. These threads then weave into memories, blending with internal experiences. Even more mysterious are the rare cases where people claim to have watched themselves from above, or traveled to places they've never been, or witnessed scenes they shouldn't logically know. No matter how one interprets these reports as brain-generated visions, subconscious metaphors, or glimpses into something beyond, they highlight a truth that modern neuroscience cannot ignore. Consciousness during a coma is not blank. It is altered, muted, distorted, or reimagined, but not non-existent. This complexity also extends to emotions. While the person in a coma cannot express feelings, the brain regions responsible for emotion may remain active. Some studies show spikes in these regions during familiar voices or comforting touch. This suggests that emotional perception can survive even when higher reasoning does not. In other words, the person may not understand what's happening, but they might still feel the presence of love or safety on some deep, hidden level. This is why so many families talk to their loved ones during a coma, hold their hand, or play music. It may not always reach the conscious surface, but it might echo through the mind in subtle ways. As we explore this strange territory more, we approach a question that blends science with philosophy. What exactly is consciousness when the layers of perception, awareness, memory, and control peel away? Is the core of who you are a set of neural processes, a persistent field of awareness that can shrink and expand, a pattern that can dim without disappearing? Or is it something that can drift, wander, and observe even when the brain is quiet? There is no definitive answer, but the coma state provides rare hints. Hints that consciousness may not depend on full brain activity to exist in some form. Another fascinating idea is that the mind during a coma may enter a state of unstructured awareness, where thoughts and perceptions occur without the usual framework of logic, language, or time. In this mode, personal identity might feel fluid. Experiences might appear symbolic or abstract. Emotions might blend together without clear cause. Some describe this as peaceful, others as strange or unsettling. But what makes it powerful is how different it feels from ordinary waking life, yet still undeniably real to the person who returns. At the same time, it's important to recognize that many coma experiences are simpler. A long blankness, a sense of floating without thought, or nothing at all. But even a memory of nothingness can be meaningful. It suggests that part of the mind is observing the absence of experience, aware enough to register the lack of awareness. That paradox alone reveals how layered consciousness truly is. Now imagine the moment someone begins to wake. The city of the mind brightens slowly. A few lights flicker on, then more. Sensory impressions return first: sound, touch, warmth. But in a slow, uncoordinated way, the person might feel as if they are rising through layers of fog, each layer clearing a bit more light. The world feels half real, half dream. The body feels heavy, distant, or strange. Words spoken nearby may sound warped or distant. Identity may return in fragments. I know this voice. I think I'm here. I think something happened. Eventually, the pieces reconnect. The mind reclaims its sense of self, and consciousness rises fully to the surface. This transition reveals something remarkable. Consciousness is not a switch, but a spectrum. It can fade, deepen, distort, and then rebuild itself. It can exist in forms we cannot easily measure, and even when we assume someone is gone from awareness, part of them may still be traveling inward, experiencing something beyond our view. When the mind returns from a coma, some people describe feeling as if they've come back from a long journey. Others feel like they've been asleep for minutes. Others feel reborn in a quiet, indescribable way. Whatever the experience, the return marks a reunion between the inner self and the outer world, a moment where consciousness steps out of the shadows and inhabits the light once again. What makes a coma so compelling is that it sits at the intersection of medicine, mystery, and the inner universe of the mind. To understand it better, imagine peeling back the layers of consciousness one by one. In everyday life, you experience a constant stream of awareness. Thoughts, sensations, emotions, all woven together. But in a coma, that weaving loosens threads unravel. Some disappear entirely, while others cling together in strange new patterns. What remains is a different kind of landscape, one that might not feel like you in the usual sense, but still contains something essential. Think of consciousness as a dynamic orchestra. When you're awake, every instrument plays in harmony. Your senses, memory, emotions, reasoning, imagination, all performing together. During a coma, the orchestra doesn't vanish. Instead, most instruments fall silent. Only a few continue playing isolated notes, sometimes in the background, sometimes unexpectedly loud. The melodies they create may not resemble normal thought, yet they can influence what a person experiences internally. These fragments of mental activity help explain why coma stories can be so vivid, symbolic, or confusing. When someone is in a coma, the silence is not always absolute. Different brain regions behave differently depending on the cause of the coma. For example, if injury affects the brain's outer layers, where complex thought and awareness occur, deeper regions responsible for emotion or sensation might still function. In other cases, the deeper regions shut down, while the outer layers remain partially active. Each pattern shapes the inner experience uniquely. This variation is one reason why two people, with medically similar comas, can have wildly different recollections. One of the strangest aspects of coma consciousness is that external and internal worlds can blend unpredictably. A voice from the real world might filter into a dreamlike scene. A medical sound, a beeping monitor, footsteps, whispered conversations might transform into symbols or characters within the internal narrative. It's almost like the mind tries to interpret whatever tiny signals reach it, weaving them into whatever storyline or sensation it's currently experiencing. If only faint fragments of reality get through, the mind might fill the gaps with imagination or archetypal imagery. Some coma survivors describe these blended worlds with uncanny accuracy. They recall hearing a nurse say something, but in their inner world, the words might appear as part of a dream involving a distant character or a symbolic environment. If someone talked to them repeatedly, the internal mind might convert that voice into a guiding figure, a presence that feels comforting or authoritative. These transformations help highlight how fluid consciousness becomes when the brain's structure for organizing thought is compromised. To understand these experiences more deeply, imagine a room filled with fog. Objects in the room still exist, but you can only see faint outlines. If someone speaks, the sound is muffled. If someone moves, you might sense the motion, but not the form. In this fog, your mind does something instinctual. It tries to make sense of incomplete information. It guesses. It interprets. It fills in blanks with imagination, symbolism, and emotion. The coma mind may function in a similar way, operating with limited input, constructing meaning from fragments. This blurring between inner and outer worlds also explains why some coma dreams feel longer or more elaborate than they could logically be. Time inside the mind doesn't follow the same rules during altered awareness. A few seconds of external sound could generate an entire internal storyline. A single touch from a caregiver might transform into a whole symbolic narrative about safety or danger. Without the usual constraints of logic and memory, the mind becomes more like a storyteller, building reality from pieces and feelings rather than facts. There are also cases where the mind retreats entirely inward, free from external influence. In these deeper states, some people describe vast emptiness, darkness, or a sense of floating. Others recall abstract sensations, not exactly emotions, not thoughts, but something in between. These experiences challenge our definitions of consciousness because they suggest awareness can exist even without clear content. If the mind is aware of nothingness, that is still a form of awareness. This leads to a fascinating idea. Consciousness may not be tied exclusively to content, memories, or perception. Even when those aspects fade, a primitive form of awareness might persist. A silent observer, a faint sense of existing, even when the thinking self is absent. Some coma survivors describe this observer as a calm presence. Others describe it as eerie or strange, as if they were aware of being, but didn't know who they were. Another element worth exploring is memory. During a coma, the brain often cannot form stable, long-term memories. This means a person might experience internal events but fail to remember them clearly upon waking. Alternatively, they might remember fragments, a feeling, a moment, a symbol, without the rest of the context. These isolated memories can feel profound because the mind interprets them as important. They might be the only surviving pieces of an inner journey that lasted days, weeks, or even months. Studies suggest that the brain in a coma may still encode emotional memories more easily than factual ones. This explains why people often recall intense feelings from their coma: relief, fear, peace, love, even if they cannot describe the scenes or thoughts that accompanied them. The emotional part of the brain may remain active, receiving signals from the environment and integrating them into internal experiences. For instance, if loved ones visited and spoke softly to the person, the emotional resonance of those visits might imprint deeply even if the words are forgotten. Similarly, a stressful environment, bright lights, loud noises, or frequent procedures might create a sense of anxiety or discomfort that manifests in symbolic dreams. These emotional imprints become part of the coma narrative in ways that can shape the person's recovery long after they awaken. Some coma survivors report vivid experiences involving familiar people, even when those people were physically present in the room visiting. In their inner world, these familiar presences might appear as guides, protectors, or companions. This echoes how the subconscious mind uses familiar figures to create comfort. The brain may recognize emotional signals before cognitive ones, allowing the inner experience to include meaningful characters even without full awareness. Then there's the matter of identity. In a coma, the usual sense of I can loosen or dissolve. Without memory, context, or perception, the mind may revert to more fundamental forms of self. Some people describe feeling like they were everywhere and nowhere. Others describe being aware of themselves only as pure sensation, warmth, pressure, floating, or presence. This simplified self could represent the most basic level of consciousness, beneath thoughts and personality. These stripped-down experiences offer rare insight into what the mind looks like without the structure we normally rely on. They hint at layers of awareness that exist independently of identity, a form of consciousness that is raw, almost elemental. It also raises a profound question. If identity disappears temporarily, does it return exactly as it was? For most people, yes. When consciousness reassembles, memory and personality usually re-emerge, but the transition can feel disorienting, as if the newly awakened self is stepping back into a life that paused without them. Some describe this as waking into a world that feels familiar but distant. Others feel like they have been reborn, not in a mystical sense, but in the sense of rediscovering their place in reality after an extended absence. Another layer to consider is the brain's attempt to heal during coma. Neural networks may be rewiring, repairing, or rerouting around damaged areas. These processes might contribute to the strange, symbolic experiences people report. If the brain is rebuilding pathways, the inner experience may reflect the reconstruction. Bursts of imagery, emotional waves, fragmented narratives. It's like watching a city rebuild itself from the inside out, with lights flickering on and off as the grid repairs. This rebuilding highlights the adaptability of the brain. Even in its lowest, quietest states, the brain remains dynamic. It continues to evolve, to process, to feel. This resilience supports the idea that consciousness isn't easily extinguished. It changes form, adapting to whatever the brain requires. Some scientists believe that coma consciousness may resemble certain deep meditative states, where awareness is present but detached from external reality. In these states, practitioners describe dissolving into a sense of vastness or presence without thought. Similarly, coma patients sometimes report experiences that sound like altered states of consciousness reached intentionally through meditation. These parallels suggest that the mind has multiple modes of functioning beyond waking thought. But unlike meditation, coma awareness is not controlled. It's a passive state shaped by injury, environment, and neural activity. The person inside has no influence over the experience. They drift through whatever the mind constructs, unable to guide or change the narrative. This lack of control is why coma experiences can be comforting or frightening, depending on the brain's condition and external factors. This brings us to a mysterious aspect many survivors mention: the presence of thresholds. Some describe reaching a point in their coma experience where they felt they had to make a choice to stay in that inner world or return to the physical one. Others describe a boundary they couldn't cross, or a moment where they sensed they were being pulled back. These threshold experiences often feel symbolic, but they also suggest that the mind may perceive recovery as a transition, a crossing from one state of consciousness to another. Of course, this doesn't mean there is literally a boundary or choice, but the brain's process of regaining consciousness can feel symbolic when interpreted internally. As neural networks reconnect, the person might experience moments of clarity or glimpses of reality that blend with dreams. This merging can create the illusion of choice or transition. Imagine drifting through a dream and suddenly sensing the outside world for the first time. A voice, a light, a sensation. The mind might translate that intrusion into a narrative moment. A door opening, a call being heard, a pathway becoming visible. The symbolic meaning is internal, but the trigger is real. These threshold experiences are powerful because they mark the beginning of awakening. They show that consciousness is rising, reorganizing, preparing to return. They also reveal how deeply the mind relies on symbolism to understand experiences that lack structure. Another fascinating part of coma consciousness is how people often describe a profound sense of calm or peace. Even those who recall confusing or frightening moments say there were stretches of stillness that felt unlike anything in normal life. This may be due to the brain's reduced activity, which quiets the constant chatter of thought. With fewer sensory inputs and less cognitive processing, the mind might settle into a simpler, more peaceful mode. On the other hand, some coma narratives contain intense emotional or symbolic distress. These experiences may reflect the brain's attempts to process trauma, illness, or fear. They may also reflect the disorientation of being aware without understanding. These emotional landscapes reveal how vulnerable the mind is when stripped of context. Despite this vulnerability, the majority of coma survivors emphasize the persistence of some form of self, even if it was faint or fragmented. This persistence suggests that consciousness is elastic. It can stretch, shrink, distort, and rebuild, but something essential remains, something that endures. As we reflect on these stories and scientific insights, we return to the central mystery. Where does consciousness go during a coma? Does it retreat, transform, narrate its own experience in symbols and fragments? Or does it drift through a borderland that exists between awareness and oblivion? What we know is that the mind does not truly disappear. It changes state. It becomes quieter, hidden, submerged. But the depth of that hidden activity reveals a truth that fascinates researchers and philosophers alike. Consciousness is not easily extinguished. It adapts, survives, and sometimes unfolds into inner worlds more strange and poetic than waking life. To explore the mind in a coma more deeply, imagine consciousness not as a single thing, but as a layered structure, like the atmosphere around a planet. The outermost layer is your active awareness, the part that speaks, reasons, responds, and makes decisions. Beneath that are layers responsible for instinct, emotion, memory, and raw perception. Even deeper are the roots of consciousness, the part that simply exists, silent, persistent, foundational. When someone falls into a coma, the upper layers collapse first. The ability to communicate fades. The sense of environment disappears. Thought becomes fragmented or stops. Yet deeper layers may continue functioning, even when the world above them goes quiet. This layered view helps explain why coma experiences range so widely. Some people drift into dreamlike landscapes filled with vivid scenes. Others float in formless emptiness. Others remain dimly aware of voices or touch. And some experience internal narratives so complex they cannot tell whether they were dreaming, hallucinating, or witnessing something incomprehensible. The diversity of these accounts suggests that consciousness is not simply on or off. It changes shape depending on how many layers remain active and how they interact. Imagine the top layers of the mind going offline like a city losing power grid by grid. The skyscrapers, bright billboards, and bustling streets fall dark. But beneath the surface, in the subway tunnels, underground rooms, and emergency lights, activity continues. It's quieter, but not gone. In a coma, the mind becomes this underground city, dimly lit, partially connected, unpredictable, but still alive. Thoughts may not resemble waking thoughts. They may come from older, deeper parts of the brain that normally work in the background. One of the most mysterious aspects of coma consciousness is the brain's tendency to create internal worlds. These worlds may be symbolic, surreal, or fantastically detailed. Some survivors say they felt trapped in long, looping scenarios. Others felt guided by figures who seemed wise, kind, or familiar. Others felt like they were traveling through landscapes, memories, or scenes that defy explanation. What makes these experiences particularly fascinating is that they sometimes contain emotional or thematic coherence, even when the brain is operating at minimal capacity. Scientists propose that these internal worlds could be dreamlike constructions triggered by random neural firing. Yet the emotional depth and symbolic meaning reported by many survivors suggests something more organized. It may be that the subconscious mind is trying to make sense of fragmented signals or attempting to maintain a sense of continuity even when higher reasoning is offline. Symbolic imagery has always been the subconscious mind's native language, appearing in dreams, visions, and meditative states. During a coma, when logical thinking is compromised, this symbolic language becomes the default mode of experience. In many accounts, people describe feeling as though their inner world was affected by external events. For example, if someone touched their hand, they might perceive it internally as warmth spreading through a dream landscape. If medical staff adjusted equipment, they might sense this as a shift in their internal environment. If loved ones spoke, their voices might manifest as whispers in a symbolic world. These translations suggest that the coma mind receives sensory information in fragments and reinterprets it through metaphor. Consider how the brain interprets sound in sleep. A loud noise might be woven into a dream as thunder or an explosion. A ringtone might become part of a scene. In coma consciousness, this kind of blending can be even more dramatic because the boundaries between inner and outer worlds are weaker. Without clear awareness, the mind grasps any incoming signal and weaves it into its narrative. The result is an inner experience that feels deeply personal, yet still connected in faint ways to the external world. Another intriguing pattern across many coma accounts is the sense of being in a place that feels separate from physical reality. Not necessarily negative or positive, but distinct. Some describe it as a realm of endless space, floating or observing. Others describe enclosed environments like rooms, tunnels, corridors, or landscapes that shift and rearrange themselves. These places often feel symbolic, as if representing the person's emotional state, memories, or identity. For example, a person who is fighting to survive might experience their coma as a struggle through darkness, water, or dense forests. Someone who is physically stable but deeply sedated might drift through a calm, expansive environment. The brain seems to express internal conditions through symbolic imagery, creating a visual or sensory metaphor for the healing process, the instability, or the inner conflict. This metaphorical nature becomes even more powerful when people describe encounters with figures, familiar or unfamiliar. Sometimes these figures appear as loved ones offering reassurance. Other times they appear as strangers with unclear roles. These encounters may be psychological constructs, blending memory, emotion, and imagination, or they may be representations of external stimuli interpreted through the inner world. Whatever their origin, these figures often play significant roles in coma narratives, guiding, comforting, or challenging the person. Another common theme is the feeling of being watched or accompanied. The mind, deprived of normal sensory input, may project its need for connection into the inner landscape. This can manifest as a sense of presence, not necessarily frightening, but undeniably real. In some cases, this presence takes the form of a protective figure. In others, it is more abstract, like a watchful awareness with no shape or voice. These experiences reveal how deeply social the human mind is, even in its most isolated states. The desire for connection persists, even when cut off from the world. Emotion plays a major role in shaping coma experiences. Emotions may be intensified or distorted due to the brain's altered chemistry. A small external trigger might feel enormous internally. A gentle touch might generate profound comfort. A distant sound might provoke fear. These emotional amplifications can color entire inner landscapes. Fear might express itself as darkness or pursuit. Peace might manifest as open, bright spaces. Confusion might take the form of shifting scenes or unclear passages. One interesting observation is that emotional experiences often linger longer in memory than visual or narrative details. Many survivors cannot recall specific scenes but remember intense feelings: safety, loneliness, calmness, uncertainty. This suggests that emotions continue to function even when cognitive processes are deeply impaired, confirming that emotional consciousness is more resilient than rational thought. There is also a phenomenon of looping or repeating experiences inside a coma. Some people feel stuck in repetitive scenarios, walking down endless hallways, reliving moments, or being trapped in cycles that seem impossible to escape. This could be the brain's attempt to process trauma or reorganize pathways, or it could stem from an inability to maintain stable narratives when the brain is in a compromised state. The looping can feel distressing during the experience, but survivors often interpret it afterward as the mind struggling to rebuild coherence. Even more mysterious are reports of people accessing memories they had forgotten while awake. Some describe recalling childhood events with extreme clarity, or reliving moments they barely remembered. This may be due to the loosening of the brain's normal filtering system. When conscious barriers fall away, memories may surface in raw, unfiltered form. These resurfaced memories often blend with dreams or symbolic imagery, creating experiences that feel emotionally vivid but difficult to interpret. Coma experiences sometimes also include perceptions of sound or speech that occur in distorted form. Because the brain processes sound differently during altered states, voices might seem slowed down, echoed, or transformed into musical tones. Some describe hearing conversations as if they were underwater. Others say voices became characters in an inner narrative. These distortions reveal how fragile and interpretive auditory processing becomes when higher functions are unavailable. Another phenomenon is the experience of being unable to move, speak, or respond within the inner world, mirroring the body's physical unresponsiveness. Some people describe trying to call out or reach for help inside their dreamlike environment but feeling unable to. This internal representation reflects the deeper reality. The brain cannot send signals to the body, so the mind may interpret that inability symbolically. Such experiences can be unsettling, but they demonstrate the close relationship between the mind's inner portrayal and the body's physical condition. Then there is the question of awareness during a coma. Is the person aware of their own condition? Some accounts suggest a vague, instinctual sense of danger, as if the inner mind knows something is wrong. Others describe complete detachment from the physical world. Still, others describe moments of clarity, brief flashes where they understood they were unconscious or injured. These flashes may represent periods where brain activity briefly increases, allowing temporary contact with reality. They can be fleeting, like windows opening and closing. An even more extraordinary pattern involves individuals who report out-of-body sensations. They feel as if they observed themselves from outside, drifting above or away from their physical form. Scientific explanations propose these experiences come from disturbances in the brain's ability to map the body's position in space. But the vividness and consistency of these reports across cultures and backgrounds raise philosophical questions. If consciousness can produce a sense of self that is not tied to the body's perspective, what does that say about how the mind constructs identity? Other coma survivors describe experiences that feel profoundly meaningful, even if they cannot articulate why. These moments may involve symbolic imagery, emotional realizations, or encounters that feel transformative. They often interpret these experiences as messages, lessons, or turning points. Even if these interpretations arise after awakening, the experiences themselves hold deep emotional weight. One striking aspect is that the meaning of coma experiences frequently becomes clear only afterward. The mind might process the experience symbolically, but the waking self interprets it through emotion. For example, someone who felt lost in darkness might see that experience as representing fear or uncertainty. Someone who traveled through a peaceful landscape might interpret it as a representation of healing. The inner experience becomes a kind of mirror, reflecting emotions, memories, or the subconscious mind back to the waking self. This reflective quality raises a powerful idea. The coma mind might express things the conscious mind avoids or cannot process. Without the constraints of logic, self-image, or inhibition, deeper thoughts and emotions surface symbolically. In this sense, coma consciousness could offer glimpses into the raw, unfiltered layers of the psyche. The mind becomes like an artist working in abstraction, expressing feelings not through words, but through landscapes, sensations, and symbolic figures. Another compelling aspect is how some coma survivors describe feeling as if they were waiting, not for something specific, but in a general sense, a feeling of suspension, like being in a place outside of time. This sense of waiting could reflect the brain's slow healing. It might represent the subconscious mind holding the self in a protective space until the physical body becomes stable. This waiting sensation often carries emotional tone, peaceful for some, frustrating or confusing for others. Time is one of the most distorted elements in coma experiences. Minutes might feel like months, weeks might feel like seconds. Some people describe their coma as a long journey, even if they were unconscious for a short period. Others describe it as a momentary blink. This extreme distortion happens because the parts of the brain responsible for tracking time are among the first to go offline. Without these structures, the mind exists in a timeless state where moments hold no fixed length. This timelessness creates opportunities for expansive internal experiences. A simple sensation can feel like an entire world. A moment of emotion might stretch into what feels like an eternity because the mind has no external reference. It measures time only through internal changes, shifts in emotion, imagery, or sensation. This internal clock operates differently from physical reality, giving coma experiences their dreamlike, non-linear quality. Yet perhaps the most fascinating part of exploring coma consciousness is the question of what remains when everything else fades. When identity, memory, perception, and logic fall away, is there still a core consciousness at the center? Many coma survivors say yes. They describe a sense of self that persisted even when nothing else did. A quiet awareness, a presence, a point of observation. It may have been faint, but it was unmistakably them. This core presence might be the foundation of consciousness, the part that simply exists. It does not think or interpret, it just is. In moments where all else collapses, this presence might be what remains. The experiences within the coma swirl around it like clouds moving around a mountain peak. In some cases, this presence feels connected to something larger, a sense of unity, vastness, or transcendence. These descriptions often sound spiritual, regardless of the person's beliefs before their coma. Whether these experiences reflect neural activity or something beyond physical explanation is a question that remains open, but their consistency is undeniable. What we discover by listening to these accounts is that the human mind is far more complex than we often assume. It can create entire worlds with limited activity. It can maintain awareness without perception. It can produce profound experiences even during deep unconsciousness. And it can emerge from these experiences changed, sometimes subtly, sometimes dramatically. When someone wakes from a coma, the return to reality can feel abrupt. The inner world dissolves. Sensation floods back in. The mind reassembles its layers. Identity returns with weight and clarity. But the residue of the coma experience lingers. The emotions, the symbols, the sense of journey. The person may struggle to put their experience into words because it belongs to a part of consciousness that does not usually speak. When we try to understand what happens in a coma, we're usually forced to rely on two things: biology and testimony. Biology gives us structure, testimony gives us the mystery. And part 4 is where those two roads begin to weave together, creating a picture that is neither purely scientific nor purely experiential, but something in between, something human, something strange, something that begins to hint that consciousness may not be a simple on-off switch, but a landscape with layers, hidden rooms, and dim hallways that remain active, even when the main lights have gone out. People often imagine a coma as a blank, an empty darkness stretching out like a disconnected void. But in reality, the brain rarely goes fully silent. It adapts, it reorganizes, it guards itself, and sometimes, quietly, it dreams. Scientists studying comas have found that the brain doesn't shut down like a computer losing power. Instead, it slips into a kind of emergency mode, an ancient survival pattern designed to protect the most essential systems. Blood flow is rerouted, energy consumption is lowered, and activity shifts from the outer layers of the cortex, where thought and planning live, to deeper structures concerned with raw endurance. But here's where things get interesting. Even in that minimal state, sparks of conscious-like activity occasionally appear. Not enough for full awareness, not enough to wake a person, but enough for patterns to flicker that resemble memory, imagination, or fragments of self. These flickers are what researchers call covert consciousness, tiny windows where the mind does something unexpected. Some patients produce neural responses to familiar voices. Others show activity when asked to imagine simple tasks, like raising a hand or walking through their home. And some respond most strongly to emotional or personal stimuli, proof that even in the depths of medical unresponsiveness, the mind may still be listening, choosing, recognizing. So what does this suggest? It implies that consciousness doesn't vanish in a coma. Instead, it sinks. It descends into layers that we don't normally visit while awake. Have you ever drifted between waking and dreaming, where you hear voices around you but can't respond? Or had moments where your mind is active but your body is frozen? These experiences give tiny glimpses into what coma patients might encounter, except stretched into long, unbroken durations with no clear anchor. Imagine floating in a place where time is not measured, where moments don't stack into days. Memory loses its sequence, thoughts lose their edges. Sensations are soft, blurred, and disconnected. In this kind of suspended inner chamber, the mind may try to build structure from whatever signals it can still detect. A familiar voice might be woven into a dream. A distant sound might distort into imagery. A memory might echo so many times it becomes a loop. People who wake from comas often report experiences that feel neither real nor unreal. Some recall hearing family members talking to them. Others remember being trapped in dream worlds that felt endless. Some describe floating through vast landscapes of sound or colour, and others recall nothing at all, which might be its own strange kind of experience. What's fascinating is that many recollections share the same emotional patterns: a sense of drifting, a feeling of suspension, a blurry awareness that something is happening, but no ability to interact with it. Even people who report nothingness often describe it not as a blank, but as a kind of peaceful fog, a place where thought itself is muted. Scientists suspect this emotional tone is shaped by the brain's chemistry during a coma. Neurotransmitters shift dramatically, altering the way fear, pain, and stress are processed. For some, this creates a calm, dreamlike state. For others, it leads to confusion or distress. But for many, it forms a background sensation, something like floating in warm water, neither sinking nor swimming. Another curious discovery is that many people report having a sense of being somewhere else during their coma. Not here, not in their body, but in a space built from fragments of memory, imagination, and sensation. These inner landscapes aren't fully coherent. They're fluid, shifting. A hallway becomes a forest, a voice becomes a waterfall, a memory becomes a room that repeats itself with slight changes, as if the mind is trying to stabilize something but can't quite hold it. This phenomenon hints at something profound, that consciousness in a coma might be untethered from normal rules. Instead of following a linear timeline, it may move in loops or spirals. Instead of forming complete thoughts, it forms impressions. Instead of building a narrative, it floats through states. But even in this drifting world, one thing tends to persist: the self. Not in its fully awake form, but in a quieter version, a presence, a watcher, someone still there, even if they cannot act. This is why researchers find it plausible that the core of consciousness, the sense of I, may remain intact even when everything else dims. Imagine that presence resting deep inside you, unable to steer the mind, but still able to experience faint sensations, fragments of memories, or distant voices. It would be like being wrapped in layers and layers of soft fabric, aware of pressure but unable to move, aware of sound but unable to speak, aware of existence but unable to reach the surface. This idea becomes even more compelling when we consider that some people who awaken from comas recall making decisions, not external actions but internal choices, like choosing to hold on, choosing to follow a voice, choosing to stay tethered to the world around them. These accounts are subjective, of course, but they raise a powerful question. Does the will survive even when the body cannot move? Is the self capable of enduring in a quiet, internal way, even when expression is impossible? If so, that means the human mind is far more resilient and far more mysterious than we tend to assume. One of the most striking things about coma experiences is how many people recall moments of clarity, even if brief, a flash of awareness, a sudden understanding that they are not dreaming, a moment where they sense the presence of others in the room. Scientists believe these flashes could correspond to brief surges in brain activity, moments where networks attempt to reconnect before slipping back into low activity. It's almost like a lighthouse beam swinging across a dark ocean. For a moment, everything is illuminated. Then darkness returns. But the memory of light remains. In a coma, the brain may attempt this reconnection many times, cycling through patterns of activity in an effort to re-establish normal consciousness. And even when unsuccessful, these attempts may create impressions or sensations that become part of the person's inner experience. A patient might not wake up during one of these moments, but they might remember the sensation of something shifting, something clearing, something opening for a split second. These are the kinds of details that hint at an astonishing possibility, that the mind is not simply off, but travelling through states we do not yet fully understand, states where awareness flickers, reshapes itself, and adapts to a world without external input. A world where time stretches or collapses. A world where the self is both present and distant. A world where consciousness exists in a uniquely altered form. When you think about it, this raises a profound question about what consciousness truly is. If it can persist in fragments, floating without structure, then maybe consciousness is not dependent on the outer world the way we assume. Maybe it has its own momentum, its own gravity, its own internal universe that continues even when the body is silent. Maybe a coma reveals something about the nature of the mind that we rarely get to see. Its ability to exist in isolation, to drift through its own depths, and to find meaning even when cut off from everything familiar. And if consciousness can persist in that suspended state, if it can survive without movement, without speech, without time, then what else might it be capable of? In this part of our journey, the idea begins to emerge that the mind may not simply fade into stillness during a coma. Instead, it may transform. It may explore. It may adapt in ways that are hard to measure but deeply meaningful. And while we still don't fully understand these altered states, one thing is becoming clear. A coma is not the end of consciousness. It is a shift, one that reveals just how mysterious the human mind truly is. We often imagine consciousness as something stable, a stream of thoughts, sensations, and perceptions flowing along a clear timeline. You wake up, think your thoughts, experience your day, fall asleep, and begin again. But a coma completely disrupts this flow. It cuts the connection between internal experience and the external world. It silences feedback loops. It removes the ordinary anchors: time, movement, social interaction, sensory detail, that keep us grounded in reality. Without those anchors, the mind becomes a drifting vessel, and the direction it drifts is largely unknown. Some scientists think of it like a deep pause, a protective shutdown, where the brain suspends higher functions to preserve energy. But others believe the coma experience could be more like a journey inward, where consciousness sinks past its usual surface and settles into deeper, more primitive layers. These are the layers where the boundaries blur, between memory and imagination, between sensation and dream, between the self and the vast hidden network of the subconscious. Imagine sinking into an ocean. At the surface, there is light and motion and clarity. But as you descend, colors fade, shapes become vague, sounds distort. Yet life still exists in the deep. It simply exists in forms we aren't accustomed to seeing. The mind in a coma may be experiencing that same descent into regions normally inaccessible during waking life. And just like the deep sea, those regions might be full of structures, patterns, and phenomena that are difficult to describe from the surface. One of the most compelling theories is that the mind in a coma operates in a state similar to certain types of dreams, specifically dreams that happen outside REM sleep. These dreams tend to be less visual, more emotional, more abstract. They often involve floating, shifting shapes, or repeating loops. They can last for what feels like minutes or years. They're not stories so much as environments, spaces of feeling rather than narrative. Many coma survivors describe exactly those sensations. They remember landscapes without clear boundaries. They recall being aware of something happening, but unable to determine what it was. They sense patterns, rhythms, cycles. They describe an internal world built from fragments of memory, familiar voices, and distorted sounds. And yet, despite how elusive these experiences are, they often contain a sense of presence, of I am still here, even if that I has no shape, no timeline, no physical body. That's what makes coma states so intriguing. The body is unmoving, the brain is in an energy-saving mode, but the core of consciousness may still be intact. We're used to thinking of consciousness as a light that switches on or off, but the coma suggests it might be more like a lantern with multiple settings. Bright, dim, flickering, glowing faintly even in darkness. This faint glow is what neuroscientists call residual awareness. It's the idea that the mind can maintain a subtle sense of self even in extreme unconsciousness, not full awareness, not active thinking, but a quiet background hum of identity, a presence without action. And if that presence endures, even in stillness, then perhaps consciousness is less fragile than we imagine. What's fascinating is that many people who recover from comas report moments where they felt they had to choose whether to return. Not in a dramatic sense, but an internal decision, subtle, instinctive, almost like leaning toward one direction or another. They describe sensing two pathways, or two states of being, and feeling drawn to one more than the other. Even though their body could not respond, their internal world had momentum, preferences, and a sense of direction. These accounts raise a provocative question. Does the mind in a coma have agency? Not the kind you use to pick up a cup or say a sentence, but the kind that exists deep inside, the quiet instinct that pushes you toward survival, toward connection, toward consciousness itself. If that kind of agency persists, then the mind might not be passive during a coma at all. It might be quietly working, navigating its own hidden landscape, trying to find a way back to the surface. Another piece of this puzzle involves memory. Many coma survivors describe their memories as scattered, dreamlike, or out of sequence. Some recall a single repeating scene that looped endlessly. Others remember fragmented voices or emotions without context, and some describe structured experiences, almost like long, ongoing dreams that developed over time. What's compelling is that these memories often contain themes of movement, traveling through tunnels, floating in water, standing in strange rooms, walking through empty cities. These are metaphors, perhaps, but they could also reflect the brain's attempt to organize internal activity in the absence of sensory input. When the mind lacks real-world data, it begins to generate its own, and what it generates may reveal something profound about the architecture of consciousness. It tends to build paths, spaces, shapes, structures that give the experience a sense of continuity. Even when the body lies still, the mind may continue creating motion. Even when the outer world is silent, the brain may create internal echoes. And even when time loses meaning, the mind may still construct an impression of progression. This suggests that consciousness may be inherently creative. When external reality is blocked, it builds internal landscapes. When sensation disappears, it creates its own stimuli. When identity becomes vague, it forms a new version of self from what remains. That creativity might be the key to understanding why many people in comas feel like they were somewhere, even if they can't explain where they weren't simply blank. They weren't simply absent. They were experiencing a new mode of being, one that exists on the border between awareness and oblivion. But perhaps the most profound aspect is how these experiences often reflect the individual. People with strong emotional bonds often recall hearing or sensing loved ones. People with deep fears sometimes describe unsettling, confusing, or claustrophobic dreamscapes. People with strong imagination describe vivid inner worlds. This personalization suggests that the coma doesn't erase who you are. It distills you. It strips away the noise of daily life, leaving only the fundamental patterns of your inner world. If you're a person who worries, the coma might echo that worry internally. If you're someone who feels deeply connected to others, that connection might anchor you. If your mind is naturally imaginative, it may create intricate, dreamlike environments. In this way, the coma becomes a mirror, not of your conscious self, but of your subconscious foundation, a mirror of the quiet mind beneath the noisy one. And that leads to one of the most challenging ideas of all. If the mind continues to experience, to feel, to imagine, even faintly, when the body is unresponsive, then consciousness might not be bound as tightly to physical action as we assume. Perhaps it can drift, float, or exist in forms we don't yet understand. Perhaps it has more autonomy, more resilience, more depth than our current science can fully measure. A coma is unlike sleep. Sleep is rhythmic, cyclical, structured, something you gently fall into and naturally emerge from every day. A coma is unpredictable, immense, and often silent in ways that sleep never is. Yet this is the only section where we mention it again, because there is something meaningful about acknowledging how different the experience truly is. In sleep, your brain continues to narrate, organize, and weave dreams between memories. But in a coma, the story unravels entirely. The narrative disappears. The mind moves without chapters, without transitions, without the gentle boundaries that sleep provides. And in this open, unstructured realm, consciousness may become something far more fluid than we normally imagine. Some people who awaken from comas describe the return as like rising from underwater. Others say it felt like they were slowly assembling, piece by piece, thought by thought, into someone coherent. Many describe confusion, but not fear, as if the mind had been resting in a place beyond complexity and was now learning how to interpret the world again. The re-entry experience is one of the great clues into what happens during the coma itself. If waking is a process of reassembling, then the coma may be a process of dissolving, not vanishing, but loosening the threads of selfhood. Imagine your identity as a tapestry woven from experiences, memories, senses, emotions, habits, and thoughts. A coma may gently loosen those threads, not destroying them, but unbinding their structure so they drift and float freely. When you wake, the mind carefully begins to weave again, reconnecting sensation, re-establishing awareness, rebuilding the sense of presence that defines consciousness. What's striking is that most people do regain that structure. They remember themselves. They recognize loved ones. They reconnect with the world. This suggests that the core of consciousness, the essence of self, may persist even in the deepest unresponsiveness, untouched by the strange silence of the coma state. The self may dim, drift, soften, but it does not simply disappear. Instead, it seems to wait. But what is it waiting in? What is that inner world like, where the boundaries blur and the passage of time becomes unknowable? Many survivors say time felt irrelevant. Some felt like they had been gone for moments, others for lifetimes. This loss of time perception may be one of the most defining qualities of the coma mind. Without external cues, sunlight, conversation, movement, the concept of time collapses. The mind might drift through a few sensations, but have no context for them. A voice becomes a distant ripple. A memory becomes a floating image without sequence. An emotion becomes a landscape with no beginning or end. In this environment, the mind behaves less like a narrator and more like an ocean, shifting currents, forming waves, quieting into stillness, and sometimes rising into brief, bright moments of awareness. Some scientists think these moments of awareness are the brain's attempts to restore normal function. Like flickers of electricity traveling through a damaged circuit, these surges may represent consciousness trying to return, testing pathways, searching for connection. And even if those moments are brief or incomplete, they might form impressions, tiny experiences that the waking mind later interprets as dreams, visions, or fragments. Other experts believe the mind might generate entire experiences during a coma, much like dreams, but without the same structure or purpose. These internal experiences might be influenced by the person's emotional state, memories, relationships, and even the sensory input that manages to reach them. A voice, a touch, a faint sound from the world around their body. Whether these experiences are elaborate dreamscapes or subtle impressions, they point to one important truth. The mind is not empty in a coma. It may be quiet, it may be distant, it may be unreachable, but it is not gone. This leads to one of the most profound questions of all. If consciousness can exist without normal sensory input, without movement, without time, then what exactly is it? Is it an emergent function of the brain that can stretch and adapt even under extreme conditions? Or is it something deeper, something intrinsic, something that persists even when the external world goes dark. A coma forces us to confront this question because it reveals that awareness is not binary. It does not simply turn on when we are awake and off when we are unconscious. Instead, it seems to exist in layers that can shift, drift, or settle into unfamiliar configurations depending on the brain's state. These layers may include everything from automatic survival processes to subtle forms of perception, to faint emotional awareness to fragments of thought. And somewhere in those layers, the sense of I may remain, even if it is only a quiet echo of its usual form. Another aspect worth considering is how personal stories shape our understanding of comas. Medical science can describe brain activity, neural pathways, and diagnostic differences between states like coma, vegetative state, and minimally conscious state, but only people who wake up from comas can describe what it felt like. Their stories are diverse but interconnected by themes of drifting, floating, looping, sensing, or existing in a world without rules. Some have peaceful experiences, others have confusing or distressing ones. Many feel suspended, as if they are simply waiting in a place that is neither life nor death. Their experiences remind us that the mind is not only biological but experiential. It doesn't just process data, it creates meaning. And even in silence, it may continue weaving sensations, impressions, and reflections out of the fragments available to it. This complexity reveals something extraordinary: the mind's resilience. It shows that consciousness can withstand disconnection, silence, and even extended stillness. It can adapt to unfamiliar states. It can survive in a suspended world where time and space lose coherence. And when the body finally begins to wake, the mind awakens with it, sometimes slowly, sometimes suddenly, but often with a profound sense of having travelled through a strange interior landscape. And perhaps this is what makes comas so mysterious. They represent a rare glimpse into the depths of consciousness, a forced journey into the subconscious, where the mind continues its quiet work far from the surface. They reveal layers of existence we don't normally access, and they remind us that consciousness is not a fragile flame, but a deep, persistent glow that remains lit in ways we don't yet fully understand. As we reach the end of this exploration, the thought lingers that a coma does not extinguish the mind. It transforms it. It shifts it into a state that is difficult to measure, impossible to compare, and uniquely revealing. A state where the self may drift but does not vanish, where awareness may dim but does not turn to nothing, where the quiet continuity of existence persists even in profound stillness. And when a person returns to the world, when they open their eyes, hear familiar voices, reconnect with their surroundings, they bring back not just survival, but a reminder of how vast and mysterious the human mind truly is.